Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Building Your Workers' Comp Book. My name is Anae Agostini. I'm CEO of CID Insurance Programs, and I want to welcome you. I also want to introduce your instructor for today. It's Darby Fisher, who's our workers' comp underwriter. And
Hi, everyone.
I also want to introduce Jacob Cole, who's our marketing specialist.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, webinar logistics, pretty much everybody knows them these days, but everyone will be muted. You'll be able to hear but not speak. And your questions are really important to us, so please pose them in the chat room at any time throughout the webinar, and we'll stop and answer your questions. And then there'll be a short survey after the webinar, and it will just pop up, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. We're always trying to make our webinars more valuable to our brokers, so that becomes, an important, your feedback becomes very important to us. So let's talk about what we're going to learn today. What's the objectives of this webinar? Definitely, Darby's going to spend some time sharpening your knowledge of workers' comp. That's always valuable because there's so many moving parts to workers' comp. Secondly, we're going to be using case studies to broaden your workers' comp strategies and better understand in an actual case situation how to really underwrite the particular risks that you're working on. And then thirdly, we really want you to understand how to underwrite a larger workers' comp risk. However, we will be talking about small, medium, and large today, and how to balance that book. And then lastly, how to effectively compete in the workers' comp arena is really important as well, because it's very competitive out there. And so she's going to give you some pointers on that. So Darby, without further ado, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Hi, everyone. So as Anae mentioned, we're going to be talking about small, medium, and large work comp submissions. So we'll get started on the small ones. Small businesses are most likely the majority of the policies you write. Small businesses are typically easier and faster to quote, and most of the time you can get a proposal in the same day, as long as you receive the required Accord 130 fully completed. This is because completing an application for a small business is much simpler, as you aren't dealing with as many class codes. The payroll and employee count is typically smaller, and the type of business is more cookie cutter and doesn't require the further underwriting review by the carrier that a middle or larger submission would. Businesses such as restaurants, HOAs, or retail stores are just a few examples of some cookie cutter exposures. And small business submissions, their accounts typically under $15,000 in premium. So if you have a smaller business, there are some items to consider. Small businesses won't receive the certain carrier services such as loss control and claims management services because they don't have the exposure to warrant that expense for the carrier. Also, depending on the carrier you submit the business to, there may be a payroll or employee count minimum that insureds need to consider in order to qualify. For example, one of our carriers, they don't write clerical only. It has to have another exposure as well. And then another carrier of ours, they require one full-time employee in order to quote. So be sure to keep the carrier restrictions in mind when receiving a small business submission. The more knowledgeable you are on the carrier guidelines, the easier it'll be for you when you submit a risk. Most of your book should be built on small business policies anywhere from the minimum premium, which could vary between $350 to $750, up to the $15,000 mark. These are the bread and butter of your book. Most of our book at CID is anywhere from the $2,500 to $15,000 range, because these policies, they're the most stable regarding rate, premium, and renewal retention. So we'll go ahead and move on to our first case study, which is our first small business submissions, and it happens to be a homeowners association, evergreen HOA. So we're going to walk through the submission on how I would approach quoting this and the important things you should know in order to avoid future problems. So this is an association, so there's no ownership or individuals to be excluded from the policy. There's only one location the employees work at, which makes it easier, and the employees are broken out full-time versus part-time. As I mentioned previously, some carriers have certain requirements regarding employee count, so it's important the insured be specific when completing the application. As you can tell, the XMOD, it says none. This isn't an experience-rated business, and the WCIRB are the ones who determine and assign an experience mod, and they do that by comparing the losses and claims of one company to all other companies in the same industry in similar size. So I know it can be a little confusing, but to break it down, sort of our example, Evergreen HOA, their payroll and claims history doesn't qualify them for an experience mod rating as they don't meet the minimum threshold. So their payroll has two class codes, 9066, which is homeowners association, and 8810, which is clerical. Homeowners associations that are new ventures or have only been in business for a year or so, you don't see a lot of restrictions on that, and they're typically acceptable for all, if not most, of our carriers. However, you do need to be able to show that industry experience, which here it's going to be 7 years. They've had no claims as they've only been in business for 1 year, so typically the carrier won't request a copy of the loss runs. If you can just have the insured verify there hasn't been any losses, the carrier usually doesn't go any further than that. So after reviewing all of this information we just went through, I'd quote the risk with all of my available markets because there's no red flags or items sticking out. They have everything broken down and easy for me. And so from review of the submission to quoting with the carriers, it took 2 days and the quote was bound on the 3rd. So the next stage to consider is reaching middle business submissions whose classes of business will produce premium from $15,000 to $50,000. You need to balance your book out with these policies as it starts to become more competitive in writing these sizes of policies. As the quoting and the binding process becomes more competitive, make sure to cover all your bases and know the risk well from the operations of the business to the insured's loss history. These submissions should always include a detailed Accord 130 and loss runs if they've had prior coverage, which they almost always do when they're of this size. And then you could also have the insured provide you a supplemental application if applicable. And the supplemental can really help answer those detailed and important questions regarding business operations that aren't listed on the Accord. These sides of the policies typically have an experience mod rating. So for those who need a refresher, anything above 100% is a debit on the policy and below is a credit. So however the claims history, it does seem to be more stable in this range of $15,000 to $50,000. So more often than not, the experience mod is on the lower end, giving the insured a credit. I do want to note that although we typically see experience mods on the lower end, it's super important to keep an eye on the experience mod, and we encourage our brokers to order loss runs at any time throughout the policy. Since work comp claims are reported directly from the insured to the carrier, our office and yours are not notified that a claim has occurred, and it puts you at somewhat of a disadvantage because an insured typically doesn't understand how a claim is going to affect the experience mod on their policy and their future ones as well. So it's important to have constant communication with the insured and stay up to date on what is occurring in their business. Although middle business submissions require more work than a small business, they're not as much of a headache compared to those larger policies we're going to talk about later on. You typically aren't going to see non-renewal notices, which can occur possibly due to a class of business the carrier is no longer writing, or you won't always see a major debit on the policy due to an experience mod that you now have to explain to the insured, whereas that could be more of the case with the larger business. So as long as you have all the required submission documents up front and know the risk well, really should be a fairly smooth process in obtaining a quote. So we'll move on to our middle business case study. And this one is Pine Tire Dealers LLC. So the entity is an LLC, so we know there's ownership within the business, and I would request the appropriate exclusion forms for all officers in the business as part of the binding requirements. This is to ensure their payroll is removed from the policy term and their final audit. Exclusion forms are put into effect the day they are received, so make sure to obtain them from your insured on their binding date. The insured has one location in California and 6 employees overall, resulting about slightly over $500,000 in payroll. I do want to touch on their XMOD because you see this one actually is rated. It's 92%, and they've had actually 3 claims resulting in $15,000. So this is a really good example of what I had mentioned earlier. Although the mod is currently an 8% credit on the policy, they really need to watch their claims because it can easily take them over 100% and become a debit. This is especially true for growing companies, so don't let your insured go to sleep on loss control. You'll need to continue to request loss runs from your carrier so you and your insured aren't surprised by their experience rating. So with all the information, the premium came to about $26,000, and the submission to quote was around 3 days, which is pretty standard as the carrier did want more information on the claims that had occurred. That happens sometimes in this middle business range. Even if there's only 3 claims, they still want that information because this is a growing company. We will see payroll increase. We will see employees increase. So some questions typically asked are the employees who filed the claim still with the company? Do they have safety training classes in place? So once I provided all that information to the carrier, we were able to bind this policy on the 4th day. So now that we have discussed the importance of small and middle submissions, we're going to talk about those big fish, your large business submissions. It's so important to have those large risks in your book of business because it obviously builds the premium within your company. So you're going to have far less of these policies, but you'll need to pay more attention to them than any other because those large business submissions are going to be those over $50,000 and are going to require the most amount of your time. So your businesses that qualify as larger accounts are going to be the ones with the greater exposure, more accidental exposure, and higher rated class codes. Businesses such as contracting and manufacturing are some of those larger submissions because they may have multiple locations, higher payroll, or multi-state exposures. For larger risks that don't have a great claims history, your carrier likely has a claims management service in place. So during COVID, we saw that the workers' comp industry, it really did manage to get through unscathed. However, coming out of that, we're really now starting to see the carriers tightening with risks that have a poor loss history, and it's showing painfully so in the insured's experience mod. And oftentimes, insureds and agents are unaware that this can double the premium overnight. So each of our carriers has their own guidelines for quoting high experience mods, but generally we can see quoting upwards of 200%, although it has gotten tighter. If the carrier sees that they are having a turnaround with those claims, possibly utilizing their claims management services, we can see the carriers, having exceptions on those high experience rated accounts. So the claims management services, they'll offer programs or resources you can utilize to create a safer workplace, resulting in fewer claims. This is going to provide a comprehensive list of tools and services to prevent losses and stay in compliance. So there'll be training resources, OSHA inspections, to return to work programs for injured workers, and self-checklists you can utilize. For insureds that have a large premium or a high-risk exposure, I highly recommend your insured sign up for this to mitigate any claims, as all carriers who do not see a turnaround in any losses are likely going to be declined. So the larger risks, they're going to get much more challenging as they can have a lengthy loss history, a high experience mod, and are more susceptible to rate and payroll change, resulting in increased premium. But if you have an in-depth understanding of the risk and its history, you can get the competitive quote and bind order. So in the next case study, I'll be giving an example of a high exposure business with poor claims and a high premium, but I was still able to get the bind order, and now I'm going to walk you through how. So this is Helix Construction, Inc. Right away, it's a corporation. So just like the middle business submission, I would be requiring exclusion forms for all of the officers to ensure that there isn't going to be any issues with the policy at the end of the audit. This risk has 3 locations in Los Angeles. So let's see. Location is something to take into consideration as the rate per class code can fluctuate based on the territory of where the business is located. So in this instance, Los Angeles, it does have a higher rated territory, so you may see the rate go up just a bit. You'll need to list out all the locations the employees work at full time. So since this is a contracting risk, employees may go to lots of job sites, but if they're not permanently going to any one job site every day for the whole year, then they don't need to be listed. So for example, if an employee is doing maintenance every day, 5 days a week at a specific site, then you would add that location to the policy. If it doesn't fall under that, then you wouldn't need to. If you do have any questions about which locations to place on a policy, you can always reach out to your underwriter and get assistance. But you really want to get this portion correct in case they are injured and a claim occurs. So this business has 23 employees. So on the application you receive, they would need to be broken out full-time versus part-time at each location. So location 1 should have full-time, part-time, and the payroll, and so on and forth for all 3 locations. Now, I do want to mention really quick that if this business were to have one location in California and another in Oregon, you'd need to make sure that the carrier you're submitting the risk to is able to write that particular class code for both states. I just wanted to touch on that because you will get multi-state exposures for these large business submissions. So that's something to keep in mind. And that application as well should break down the payroll and employees for each location or each state. So going back to the case study now, the insured's experience mod is pretty high. It's 169%. So off the bat, this tells me they do have extensive claims activity, possible open claims or high incurring claims. The experience mod is a rolling figure, and I don't know if a lot of people know that. So the claims may not have occurred in the last year or so. However, they're now affecting the experience mod. That's what a lot of insureds don't realize, is that the claim is going to affect future policy terms as well. So what this means right now is they're being charged a 69% debit on the policy. They have 2 classifications on the policy, 5403, which is carpentry whose wages does not equal or exceed $35 an hour, and then the 5432 is those whose wages do go over $35 or equal that. I wanted to bring this up because with contracting risks especially, there's some class codes that have payroll limitations, and so it's important that where you're placing the employee payroll, you get that correct. At the end of the presentation, actually, I'm going to go over a tool you can utilize in order to find class codes if you're unsure. So in all, this premium comes out to about $69,000, and we're actually going to break down the risk summary in the next slide. So if you want to bind and retain large business submissions, you need to be on your game and know the details of the risk. This is going to create such a smoother process and get you a quote quicker. So you need to make sure you have all the proper information to review and analyze your insured. The loss history is going to be mandatory for quoting due to a high experience mod, and I think one point we can agree on is that this insured should be utilizing the loss control, and with the right carrier, they can turn this around. They have 12 claims, and it's almost $200,000. So that immediately, when reviewing that application, would stand out to me. And also the fact that they've been with 4 carriers in the past 7 years. So I would turn around and ask, like, were they non-renewed? If so, was it due to claims, or what caused them to keep moving carriers? That's something I would want included on the application because I know the carrier will ask that. So for this risk of this exposure and size, I would also have the insured complete a supplemental application if I wasn't already provided with one. So this is usually something required by large business submissions, especially with an exposure of this type. So there might be some underwriting questions asked, such as, do you work below ground? Describe your last project. Residential or commercial work? What percentage of subcontractor you use? Those are the typical questions asked when starting the preliminary meet and greet with the insured, especially any contracting risks. I do want to mention that work comp, especially because we're talking about a contracting risk, work comp doesn't offer coverage for only 1099 employees. You have to have at least one payroll employee in order to quote. So for this account, going back to it, I would want to see an experience mod sheet to get the history of what's been going on with this. When you run into submissions with a lot of claims, I want to know what's going on with their operation and why are there so many claims occurring. Have they put any safety measures in place? That's something I definitely want to review because with the right carrier, you can actually plead your case for the insured as to, they're turning things around. So getting an understanding of what's going on, it'll help the submission. So if you have a good submission, which means a complete one, we can normally submit this to our carriers right away. Larger accounts would be referred to underwriting management for review. But if you have everything up front, it really should be released in 1 to 2 business days. So as I mentioned, we do hold great relationships with our carriers, and we can negotiate a good competitive premium. So overall, we were able to quote this within 4 days, which is a great result given everything going on, and obtain a bind request on the 5th day. So now we're just going to go over just a new business, how to get a quote fast. It's kind of a summary of everything I've been discussing, but just to break it down in simplest terms, like what is considered a complete submission. So you're going to need a complete Accord 130 that includes the entity, business name, their FIN number, how many years in business, all locations the employees work at every day, the insured's contact information, and ownership within the business. In order to provide your insured with a quick and competitive quote, it's important to have a good understanding of the risk you're submitting and ask the appropriate questions to your insured up front. So just like we discussed in the case study, you need to know what the business is and what services they're offering, because especially now after COVID, we're finding that companies perform more than one type of service. So be sure the insured is listing all services, as most companies are diversified. So if you aren't accurate with classifying employees at the time of audit, they could be placed into a higher rated class code, resulting in owed premium. Classifications can be tricky if the insured has not had prior coverage. So the 2 places I utilize to classify businesses that I'm not even sure of are the WCIRB and the NCCI. The WCIRB is going to be for classifications for risks inside California, and then anything outside of California, you're going to go to the NCCI. Jacob's actually going to link both of those sites for you. And of course, then you're going to need the loss runs for any insured with prior coverage. And for those middle and larger risks in your book, loss runs are necessary when quoting with a carrier. So if you obtain all of these things, have a good understanding of your risk, get that supplemental for the larger ones, utilize all the services that the carrier is offering, You're going to be able to find competitive quotes for small business, middle, and large.
Okay, Darby, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. I want to make sure that you guys visit our website, CIDinsurance.com. We have lots of broker tools, and we have upcoming webinars, and we have all of our recorded webinars. This webinar will also be uploaded and will be available for you or any of your other employees in your office to watch. You can contact Darby at CIDinsurance.com, and then her phone number is there. She does answer her phone, and she does answer her email, so she's ready to help you. And then go ahead and submit at submissions@CIDinsurance.com. Again, our website has lots of great tools that will be helpful to you. And thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to doing business with you. Take care.